One of Nintendo's most unusual partnerships in recent years has been with Forever Entertainment, a team-up which in 2025 bore banana-shaped fruit in the form of Donkey Kong Country Returns HD. But what is the future for this partnership, and is it even possible that this could in fact lead to the Polish remake specialists taking on the reins of a fully original 2D Donkey Kong title? Let's start by understanding the background so far. Who exactly are Forever and what do we know about their partnership with Nintendo so far? Based in the northern Polish city of Gdynia and founded in 2010, Forever Entertainment has been publishing titles at a rate of roughly 6 per year for a considerable time. Most of these are smaller indie titles, but they have also made deals with a number of Japanese companies to port classic games to new hardware. In 2020, they published a port of the Sega Saturn classic Panzer Dragoon, and in 2022, they brought over another beloved Sega title, their arcade shooter House of the Dead. Their Sega partnership appears to have stalled somewhat, though, with the confirmed Panzer Dragoon Zwei reportedly still in development after more than 5 years since the original. They also partner with Square Enix to bring over the Front Mission games to modern consoles, with the third remake in the series debuting in January 2026. Now, the reception to these games appears to have been overall fairly muted. Personally, I love the Panzer Dragoon series, and although I always found the first by far the weakest link in the trilogy, I had a whale of a time revisiting it, even though I can't say it captured graphically the spirit of the original for me, and the lack of a consistent frame rate drew criticism, though reportedly it performs far better on Switch 2, which I hope bodes well for the dramatically named sequel Panzer Dragoon Zwei to drop in due course. The passion of the original developers certainly shone through, but Eurogamer's words in their own review seem like they could apply to an awful lot of Forever's work. Their work is spotty, with few too many oversights and blunders than would be ideal, but the spirit of 1995's Panzer Dragoon emerges intact. And yet, in June 2021, Forever announced a publishing deal with none other than perfectionists Nintendo, reportedly to see the release of several new games and the studio receiving financial backing from Nintendo. Now, this is fairly unusual because while Nintendo contracts many studios, this normally doesn't hit the press. In this case, though, I don't think it was intended on Nintendo's part necessarily that it would become such a public statement, but it seems more likely to have come from the regulatory compliance, as the news originated from a notification to the Financial Supervisory Authority of Poland. This sounds like a fairly standard contract arrangement for the production of Switch titles, therefore, and they did specify Nintendo Switch, although of course Switch 2 was still little more than a twinkle in Mr. Kawamoto's eye back at that point. My first impression of the deal was that it's possible that it could even not be for first-party titles, given the support Nintendo has sometimes offered indie studios and the acquisition of Shiver Entertainment in America to support with third-party porting work. However, in June 2024, 3 years after the deal was confirmed, we had the announcement of Donkey Kong Country Returns HD, a game which was universally received as one of the games that released on Switch during 2025. The remainder of these several titles that were mentioned originally, well, these remain in the wind. Now, Nintendo has a number of studios that they use to bring old content to new hardware, even though they weren't involved with the original in any way. There's a secondary studio at Grezzo who have mostly worked recently on Beantopia, and there are 2 different groups at Australian developers Tantalus responsible for such endeavours as well. The team behind Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword, and a quite separate team who brought over 2024's Luigi's Mansion 2 HD. The thing that struck me most about Returns HD was that it was a great game from the Wii. It makes logical sense to me that once the Forever team gets an understanding of the original Wii hardware, it should expedite the process of further ports. As it happens, the Wii has a number of titles with potential for bringing over, but once you remove those titles that have already been brought over to newer hardware, such as the Super Mario Galaxy titles, Kirby's Return to Dreamland Deluxe, Zelda Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword, and then those such as WarioWare, which are likely to have their content cannibalized into newer titles rather than ported if they're brought over at all, well then you're left with a less obviously promising list of games, a non-exhaustive list, might include Donkey Kong Barrel Blast, Excite Truck and Excite Bots, Battalion Wars 2, Link's Crossbow Training, Mario Super Sluggers, Metroid Other M, Metroid Prime 3, New Super Mario Bros. Wii, Punch-Out, Sin and Punishment Star Successor, Super Paper Mario, Wario Land Shake It, plus any number of Wii titles such as Wii Music, Wii Play, and Wii Chess. Most of these feel like the kinds of titles that would be better off populating a putative Nintendo Classics app in the future, but obviously emulating the Wii on Switch 2 could be tricky, and Nintendo probably has enough material to keep Nintendo Switch Online members happy for a good time to come with GameCube and probably the DS at some point in the future. Probably the titles that make the most sense here commercially would be New Super Mario Bros. For the Wii and Super Paper Mario, although the latter feels like it would be more likely to be handled by Intelligent Systems, as they did themselves with the Thousand Year Door. There's also Wario Land Shake It and Punch-Out, which I feel are plausible low-effort ways to keep a toe in these franchises. Both series are the subject of separate videos, though. As for Mario Super Sluggers, it might seem like an odd one, but I wouldn't rule it out on the basis that Switch hasn't had a Mario Baseball entry, even though GameCube, Wii, and through Sports Superstars 3DS did. It's not like Nintendo to miss a sports option for Mario, but I do cover this in a separate video. I think on balance it's more likely that Nintendo will find a new permanent team, and Poland isn't particularly famous for its baseball aficionados, but if their deal includes a handful of games, well, I could see Mario Baseball making some sense for inclusion if they decide to simply port over the original Wii Mario Baseball. On balance, though, it's probably not that likely. However, if they're going to develop an original title, why not the obvious? Grezzo worked on Zelda remakes and now are the developers of 2D Zelda. Mages brought over Famicom Detective Club to Switch and then created their own in Emio. Even the rebuilt full-strength new retro studios of the 2020s started its journey back to prime position by remastering the original Metroid Prime, and then there's Eighting and Mercury Steam, who have followed similar paths on Pikmin and Metroid. I didn't even consider this in my recent deep dive on 2D Donkey Kong, but shout out to Goran Isaacson in the comments for flagging this as a possibility. On the one hand, instinctively, the standard of Forever titles so far doesn't exactly confer confidence that 2D Donkey Kong will be incredibly safe in their hands, but then again, Nintendo would be heavily involved themselves in any development, and it would fit their profile of cultivating secondary studios for regular game development work on their key franchises. So, I consulted the credits of the games. Usually, though, when I look at the credits for clues, it's a little easier to unpick. For example, I'm fairly confident that the Eighting team who worked on Pikmin, the Mercury Steam team who worked on Metroid, and the Tantalus team who worked on Zelda Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword HD are all likely to have games coming fairly soon, simply because there's a large number of people whose recent credits comprise 2 consecutive Nintendo games, and only 2 consecutive Nintendo games, with no indication that they are working on anything else in the meantime. All these people have different groups working on different titles at once, but it seems evident to me that there are specific teams here within these companies dedicated to Nintendo where a trusted relationship has been cultivated. The difficulty with Forever is that we only have one game as a precedent. Director Adam Arseniak had a few special thanks in 2024, but he was last the creative director of Timberman: The Big Adventure, released in 2023, so it seems unlikely that he was fully focused on Donkey Kong Country Returns HD for the entire 3 years. Most of the other developers have received recent credits, although notably senior game producer Peter Albrecht hasn't had games in recent years, and the senior art director appears not to have had credits since 2020. The question is then, were these people fully focused on Nintendo content all this time, or spinning many other plates at once? And will they become a new Nintendo-focused team, or are they just part of the Forever team who might go over to various Nintendo projects as and when the opportunity arises? It feels plausible that we might get a Nintendo-aligned group within Forever, but the extent of this remains unclear. Let's also consider Donkey Kong Country Returns' development schedule. As far as it's possible to determine, if the deal with Forever was struck in the summer of 2021, the Donkey Kong Country Returns HD game presumably had a 3-year development window allotted to it, meaning that it was probably due to be released in late 2024. It was rated by the German Ratings Board, the USK, on the 5th of August 2024. As it turned out, though, the game was dated to about 5 weeks after the scheduled opening of the Donkey Kong Country section of the Super Nintendo World theme park area in Japan. All this adds to a layer of ambiguity around the whole thing because it's perfectly possible that the game could have been ready a fair time before, but it's certainly not a case like Metroid Prime Remastered where the classification took place nearly 20 months before the game finally released. In all likelihood, it did take the full 3-year cycle, and while being familiar with the Wii might expedite further ports from Forever, given the relatively small sizes of these teams and the range of different projects Forever have on their plate at once, my guess is that the next game might not be until 2027 or 2028, a further 3-year cycle, though notably, the Front Mission trilogy were done in far quicker time periods than the first one. One possibility is that they stick with Donkey Kong, but not, as I'd assumed, the Wii, leveraging any experience they had at working on the franchise specifically. In this case, Jungle Beat would be the obvious one to bring over. I don't really rate the chances of the Wii Racer Barrel Blast, which had some extremely mediocre ratings at the time, but I suppose we can't necessarily rule anything out. The other title I think has a fair chance of coming out from Forever at some point is New Super Mario Bros. There has been no 2D Mario since Wonder, and if the EPD10 development group are pivoting to a Mario Maker of some description, which I increasingly think is likely, having another 2D Mario might be useful, perhaps even for 2030, an all-star style 3-pack with the DS and 3DS games. It might seem a long time in the future, but Nintendo are happy to have these ports made and then sit on them until the time is optimal to release. What else could be likely? Well, spare a thought for the Excite series. Excite Truck, Excite Bots, and Excite Bike World Rally would make a plausible way to keep this franchise alive. Hiro Yamada, who has been a supervisor or advisor on all the games in this series since the N64, was last credited as the coordinator of Skyward Sword HD, but may still be at the company. Also, Excite Bike World Rally was one of the first games as supervisor for Kodai Matsumoto, who has since gone on to work as an assistant director on Mario Sports Superstars, which of course had a baseball element as well as coordinating on Donkey Kong Country Returns for both Switch and 3DS. Now, all of this is very murky, and so makes it especially tricky applying my usual approach of offering percentage-based forecasts of likelihood to judge against later on. Let's therefore say these specific statements right now. 90% there will be another Forever Entertainment first-party game before the end of 2030. 70% the next Forever Entertainment first-party game will be a Wii port. 50% the next Forever Entertainment first-party game will be released by the end of 2027. 30% the next first-party game will be one of an Excite title, a Mario Baseball title, New Super Mario Bros. Wii, Punch-Out, or Wario Land Shake It. 10% a Forever Entertainment version of Donkey Kong Jungle Beat will be announced by the end of 2029. As for Nintendo handing Forever Entertainment a passport to Donkey Kong Country itself, I honestly find it pretty hard to imagine at this point, and so while the odd credit is possible on the next 2D Donkey Kong from Forever, as Nintendo uses Kong-adjacent partners to their best effect, I'm going to say it feels only like a 10% chance, and that's top whack, that Forever will be the lead developers on the next 2D Donkey Kong. Now check out the videos on screen for more, check out the Patreon for even more early ad-free and exclusive content. I'm grateful for anyone who drops a comment below, and in any event, I'm just so grateful you're here, and I'll see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.